This summer's general election was a disaster for the Conservatives. Not only did they lose power for the first time in 14 years, they returned the lowest number of Conservative MPs since the emergence of the party system. Labour picked up seats in places like Bournemouth, Norfolk and Rushcliffe that could be relied upon to deliver Tory MPs until the end of time. To put this into perspective, the last time the Tories did this badly, Churchill's great-great-great-grandfather was a young man. John Harrison was working on his clock, and James Watt was starting to consider the inefficiencies of steam engines. It was a long time ago. So could this be the end of the Conservative Party? It's a question worth asking. Before we start feeling too sorry for them, though, it's worth saying that this was a pretty disappointing set of governments. In 2010, they came to power promising to slash the deficit and bring the books into balance. In 2024, after years of austerity, tax rises and public spending cuts, the deficit still exists and public debt is at its highest level since the 1960s. In 2015, they promised a long-term economic plan. The outcome? Investment was not forthcoming, and in 2024, per capita income has still not recovered from the financial crisis. In 2017, the headline policy to fund social care tanked their chances of a majority and then was unceremoniously dropped. In 2019, they promised to get Brexit done, and while there's still much to work out, I guess we have to give them this one. Perhaps this performance explains why recently it seems the only thing that the Conservatives have left to offer are culture wars about refugees and trans people. There are structural reasons you might expect the Conservatives to perform poorly in government. As a party, they're generally unrepresentative of the UK, and there is a particular misalignment between Conservatives and those people who need effective government and public services the most. Their MPs are consistently more privately educated than other political parties, and so removed from the concerns of the public that have to rely on public services. Their members and voters are considerably older than the UK average, and therefore less exposed to the long-term consequences of poor government. Their donors are clustered in the financial services and housing industries, as well as high net worth individuals who are probably not overly concerned with well-funded public services. So if the Conservative Party has performed poorly, and there are structural reasons to expect that this isn't actually a fluke, let's look at what the future holds for the most successful political party of the 20th century. As it stands, the Conservatives are out of government, but comfortably hold the second best position in the UK party system: official opposition. The official opposition is the second largest party in the House of Commons. Politically, it's a lot better to be the official opposition than the party which comes third. Some of the perks include more opposition days where you can define what the Commons debates, 6 questions for the Leader of the Opposition at PMQs, opportunities for shadow ministers to question ministers, more public funding, known as short money, amounting to £22,000 per year for each MP elected, and a further £44 for every 200 votes gained by the party. Public funding for the Leader of the Opposition's office, worth over £1 million per year, and increased media coverage, often getting the first response to the government in any news story. But the biggest advantage of being the second party is that in a first-past-the-post system, they're the most likely to be able to beat the government, and that means the Electoral Elastic works for them. What this means is that when the British public gets sick of this Labour government, they will know that voting Conservative is a good way to throw the rascals out. So while the Tories have just suffered a catastrophic defeat, there is a good chance that they'll be back. If you want to defeat the Conservatives once and for all, then you need to replace them as the official opposition. So next, we'll look at the UK's other political parties to see if they have what it takes. After Labour and the Conservatives, the party that gained the highest number of votes at the election was Reform UK. They are perhaps as likely to join the Tories as replace them, and if you're unimpressed by the last government's culture wars, these guys are probably not who you'll want to turn to. With a manifesto of immigration limits, unfunded tax cuts and scrapping the net zero target, they are the party for Tories who are too Tory for the Tory party. The Greens gained 2 million votes and 4 MPs in 2024. There's probably not a lot of room for them to replace the Conservatives, as they oppose Labour from the left on most issues, with pledges of taxing wealth, high incomes and bringing the net zero target forward from 2050 to 2040. The SNP gained 9 MPs at the last election, and while they are committed to ending Conservatives in government, that won't help anyone in England, as their vision is for Scotland to become independent. That leaves us with one, only semi-realistic option for replacing the Conservatives as the official opposition. The Liberal Democrats, or LibDems, are the awkward middle child of British politics. Sometimes to the left of the Labour Party and sometimes to the right, they have a habitual distrust of the Conservatives, but nonetheless formed a coalition with them in 2010, after which the Lib Dems lost most of their seats. Their views are well within the mainstream of British politics, with one big exception. They want to change the voting system to proportional representation. This would mean that parties would gain representation in the House of Commons according to the proportion of their vote they receive. And, for example, the Labour Party could never win 63% of the seats for 34% of the vote, as they did in 2024. Formed from the old Whigs, the Liberal Party of Gladstone, Asquith and Lloyd George was historically one of two main parties in British politics with the Conservatives, until the 1920s when they were supplanted by the Labour Party, never to recover. Since then they have served as a rump of their former selves, a repository for mavericks and protest votes. In 1988 they joined the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, a centrist breakaway from the Labour Party to form the Liberal Democrats. When compared to the other contenders to defeat the Conservatives and become Britain's second party, they have many advantages. They have a lot more seats, less than 50 fewer than the Conservatives. They have a party machine and a presence all over the country. They are better funded and entitled to more short money than the smaller parties. They are often to the right of the Labour Party and can appeal to Conservative-leaning voters. And finally, they are not a single-issue party. So, the Conservatives are historically unpopular. The Lib Dems are only a few seats away, and there's a real chance that the Tories will learn none of the lessons from the last government for at least 5 years. How hard could it be for the Lib Dems to overtake them at the next general election?
It'll be difficult, lemon difficult, that is what it will be.
Let's look at the map from 2024. Labour won a massive victory. At first glance, it shows just how close the Lib Dems and Conservatives are in terms of seats. There's more blue for sure, but not that much. Now let's look at a more interesting map. This is a map of which party came second in each seat. Broadly, it shows who Labour beat. The SNP in Scotland, Reform and the Tories in the north, the Greens in the cities, and the Lib Dems almost nowhere. This map shows why it's exponentially harder for the Lib Dems to form a government than it is for the Tories. Here's where the Lib Dems came second, and here's where the Conservatives did. There's just not that many places where the Lib Dems can pick up seats. But it gets worse for the Lib Dems. The road back to government for the Tories is shockingly simple. To find out why, we need only to look to the run-up to the 2024 election. These are the opinion poll averages from 2019 to 2024. In 2019, Boris beat Jeremy Corbyn, promising to get Brexit done, whatever that meant. The whole mess unravelled from there. There were many ups and downs, but I think there were three decisive events in the last Parliament. First, Labour got a credible leader that the electorate could see becoming Prime Minister. Second, Partygate hit the Conservatives and they never really recovered. And the coup de grace was Liz Truss's wild ride. So if that's why the electorate chucked out the Tories, what could possess them to bring them back? The Conservatives would only need to do three things. Get a credible leader, apologise for the mistakes the electorate still blame them for, and wait for Labour to make some mistakes. With these simple changes, the Conservatives will attract back their donors, talent and voters. From there, they just need to hug a few huskies, and before you know it, we're waking up with the bloodsuckers the day after the election. So now let's turn to the inevitable outcome of the next election. You may think it's too early to predict, but I know exactly how it will go. Labour will win again. They won't have embarrassed themselves, fallen apart or destroyed the country, and the electorate will be at least somewhat interested to see what they could do with a second term. Or, the electorate will coalesce behind a credible opposition, and that opposition will have consistently opposed Labour's mistakes and attempted to offer a plausible alternative. In a two-party first-past-the-post system with majority governments, voters make their decision not based on who they want in government, but rather on whether or not they want to throw the rascals out. To win, the Lib Dems have to be that credible opposition. At this point, it's worth asking ourselves what the Lib Dems want. I think it's fair to say that the instincts of many Liberal Democrats, and what would be most comfortable for them, is to continue what they are currently doing. Attacking the Conservatives on almost everything, agreeing with Labour when they want the same thing and opposing them when they don't, not getting too deep into the details of policy in the way, say, a governing party has to, and above all, keeping their options open so at some point they are able to form a coalition and bring about proportional representation. Culturally, the LibDems are a party of people very interested in British politics, but are unable or unwilling to choose between Labour and the Conservatives. Almost all of their policy positions have been tried on by one or the other party at one point, and either way, most of them are a matter of degree rather than principle, with the big exception of proportional voting. Yet the LibDems have deliberately chosen to remain on the sidelines, highly unlikely to get into government. Deep down, they believe they oppose Labour and the Conservatives equally, and are never more comfortable than when they're fighting Labour in some places and Conservatives in others, occupying a sort of idealistic centre ground. Essentially, this is the Charles Kennedy strategy, and in the 2020s, it is a strategy doomed to failure. Let's see why. This is a graph of tracking the change in the Labour vote in seats the Lib Dems won between the notional 2019 results and the 2024 election. So, in most cases, in an election where the result looked like this, the Labour vote actually went down in Lib Dem seats. Perhaps these voters were really impressed with the sterling leadership of Ed Davey, or maybe they really grasped the differences between Labour and Lib Dem manifestos. Perhaps. But my bet is previous Labour voters were so sick of the Tories that they voted Lib Dem to ensure the Conservatives would lose. Since the vast majority of Lib Dem MPs were elected for the first time in 2024, I think it's fair to say that their voter base is a largely anti-Tory one. If we look at the seats that they have won, they are overwhelmingly from the Conservatives. If we look at the seats where they came second, they're still mainly opposing the Conservatives. As it stands, the Lib Dems offer no significant threat to the Labour Party, and most of their MPs have been elected on a wave of anti-Conservative feelings. As the Electoral Elastic starts to spring back, this does not bode well for current Lib Dem MPs. Let's imagine that this is the 2024 vote share in a typical seat where the Lib Dems won. With Labour in power, inevitably making mistakes, and the Conservatives safely in opposition where the voters can forget about them, what changes can we expect in voting intention across this Parliament? The first thing we can expect are previous Labour or Green voters who voted Liberal Democrat to ensure a Conservative loss to start to drift back to their natural parties, especially as the threat of a Tory government becomes less scary and less urgent. 2024 Lib Dem voters will also probably become less enthused and harder to turn out. 2024 Reform voters' priorities will change from sending the Tories a message to evicting Labour from power. In fact, voters of all opposition parties that feel Labour need a kicking or need to lose office will start to look for a likely alternative. Most importantly, that includes electors that didn't vote in 2024. And most important of all, previous Conservative voters will be activated by their distrust of Labour in power. None of these dynamics are good news for newly elected Lib Dem MPs. To become the official opposition, the Lib Dems will have to flip the direction of the Electoral Elastic and use it against the Conservatives. They need a strategy that will not only allow them to hold their current seats, but will allow them to make further gains, ideally against the Conservatives. Hardest of all, they will need to convince people who voted Conservative in 2024, people who stood by the Tories in their worst defeat since 1761, the absolute floor of the Conservative vote, to switch to Lib Dem. This map shows why. This is a map of every seat where the Lib Dems got more than 10% of the vote. The vast majority are in the southern heartlands of Tory England. If the Lib Dems want to advance, they need to focus on the Conservatives. So what strategy should they follow to do this? Your first thought might be that the Lib Dems should continue to attack the Conservatives while they're down. Keep up what's working and finish the job. That will not work. Attacks on the Conservatives worked well while they were in government, and while the Lib Dems were building an anti-Tory coalition. As we've seen though, that coalition has already begun to fall apart, and there is no way to recreate that urgent anti-Conservative feeling while they're in opposition. The voters the Lib Dems need now have no problem with the Conservatives. They voted for them, and they voted for them at their absolute lowest ebb. So let's have a look at these Conservative voters. Almost 7 million people voted Conservative in 2024, about double the number that voted Lib Dem. They conform pretty accurately to the Conservative stereotype. Older, richer, more religious, and as you might expect from older people, they are more likely to consider themselves Christian and less likely to have a degree. The diagram on the right is from Lord Ashcroft polls conducted at the end of the election campaign and shows the attitude gaps between Conservatives, Liberal Democrats and the other parties. Again, your instincts are probably correct, but it's important to remember that this graph is displaying the average attitudes of Conservative voters. The Lib Dems only need to secure a few million extra votes to become the official opposition. This graphic shows what percentage of voters supported their favourite party and what percentage voted tactically to block another party. As you can see, it's difficult reading for Lib Dems, as it seems around half of their 2024 vote supported them to keep somebody else out. However, 27% of Conservative voters were also voting tactically, even at their lowest ebb. It's possible that these were people who wanted to vote Reform, but instead voted to block Labour. But it shows that the electorate are sophisticated in how they place their votes. Perhaps if Lib Dems could oppose Labour credibly, then previous Conservative voters would be open to switching their allegiance. As we have seen, there is a certain cultural division between Lib Dems and Conservatives, but if we look at the issues they think are most important, it's remarkable the level of overlap. According to this poll, the top 5 priorities for Lib Dems are the NHS, cost of living, climate change, leadership, and the economy. For Conservatives, it's the economy, immigration, the cost of living, leadership, and the NHS. The Lib Dems will have to approach climate and immigration carefully if they are to fuse these two coalitions together, but the vast majority of the messages should be compatible. And remember, even on climate change and immigration, the Lib Dems only need to come far enough to win half the Conservative vote. But won't these Tories just defect to Reform? It is possible, especially in the north where Reform came second in so many seats. However, if we look at this YouGov poll, we see that 51% of Conservative voters prefer the Lib Dems to Reform, and 76% prefer the Lib Dems to Labour. We must treat these figures with a bit of caution as we're deep in the crosstabs here, but I think we can conclude that if the Lib Dems can make the salient choice at the election between the Lib Dems and Labour, then previous Conservative voters, even 2024 Conservative voters, will back them. That is how the Lib Dems can beat the Conservatives, not by fighting the electoral elastic, but by turning it around. Let's see how that would look. Now, if the Lib Dems were a more effective, more visible opposition to Labour than the Conservatives, the electoral elastic would act on voters differently. Tactical Green and Labour voters would still drift back. Some Lib Dems would still be less excited, but they would be countered by a few more anti-Labour non-voters getting excited. Some Reform voters will move to the Conservatives to knock out Labour, but a few will move to the Lib Dems. How will they justify this? They will just want to get rid of Labour. Indeed, all opposition voters will start to look for ways to get rid of Labour, but because the Lib Dems are the most credible opposition, they will go there rather than to Conservatives. Finally, while disaffected Tory voters will start to drift back, Tories who just want to get shot of Labour will go to the Lib Dems. Now these results are all based on the Lib Dems being a more credible opposition in the minds of the public than the Conservatives. They will have to be doing the job of the official opposition before they can become the official opposition. But what does that mean exactly? They will have to oppose Labour credibly. They will have to do this often, almost all the time. If Labour aren't wrong on the policy, then they're wrong on how they're implementing it. They're wrong on how they're funding it. They're wrong not to go further. But they are always wrong. The Lib Dems will have to put away all concerns about harming the Labour government and letting the Tories back in. Remember, the Lib Dems are the ones coming back in, not the Conservatives. And what of the Tories? In Lib Dem rhetoric, they should be derided for being failures rather than just being wrong. They lack unity and they can't offer a coherent opposition to Labour. Even better, just ignore them completely. This is a Lib Dem versus Labour fight now. Many of the voters the Lib Dems are aiming for have voted Conservative for a long time. There's no need for the Lib Dems to remind them that they were wrong. So, the Lib Dem machine must divide. The air war must focus on opposing Labour, while the ground war ruthlessly targets Tory strongholds. Serious efforts must be made to get attention, not only for the Lib Dem leader, but also their shadow spokespeople. Campaigners and MPs that have cut their teeth attacking the Tories will need to switch their focus to Labour. They will have to resist being triggered into delivering their old Tory attack lines. They need to do everything that they would have been expected to do if they had won 200 seats in 2024. They will also have to carefully move their rhetoric from what is comfortable for their current coalition of voters to what is comfortable for their hoped-for coalition of voters. Perhaps less focus on climate change, more focus on immigration, and less property tax talk? Now, to LibDems watching this may all feel a bit uncomfortable, and you may not be sure this is what you want. You may remember times when shifting rightwards was not a great idea for the LibDems, and you're quite happy where you are now. To that I say, it's time to get serious. I know that sounds harsh, but that's only because it is. Politics is a contact sport, and there's no more ruthless player than the Conservative Party. The Conservatives are the natural party of government. They are well funded, experienced, an election-winning machine. They are not the most successful political party of the 20th century for nothing. As I write this, Labour have started rolling the pitch to raise taxes in the next budget. While this may be sensible fiscal policy, it's terrible politics, as they have just been elected on a manifesto that ruled out most tax rises. So let's see how the Conservatives oppose them.
When Labour was last in office, we were borrowing double current levels. And will she confirm another difference between today and 2010? The Conservatives came to office then being honest about our plans and saying very straightforwardly we needed to cut the deficit, whereas she's just won an election telling us repeatedly taxes will not go up. How many seats were won on the back of commitments not to raise tax, while she's quietly planning to do the exact opposite?
Jeremy Hunt denies Labour's claims and attacks them effectively for lying to the electorate. He is opposing clearly and loudly. It doesn't matter if he thinks the policy is sensible, he is opposing. He's holding Labour to account for their own promises. Now let's listen to the Lib Dem response.
Years of Conservative chaos and mismanagement have left our economy on life support and in desperate need of emergency care, and things cannot go on like this any longer. We must now revive growth by getting people off NHS waiting lists and back into work. So we urge the government to invest wisely in GPs, dentists and hospitals to not only support patients, but also to improve efficiency within the NHS and deliver the growth so desperately needed after years of Conservative failure.
Sarah Olney started by attacking the Conservatives, putting her at odds with all the voters watching who may have agreed with Jeremy Hunt or voted Conservative in 2024. Exactly the sort of voter the Lib Dems need to win. She goes on to urge Labour to do exactly what they said they wanted to do, without any attack on their duplicity. These are cherry-picked examples, but they show my point. A voter who's angry at Labour may well ask, what good are Lib Dems for opposing Labour? The good news is that Jeremy Hunt is unlikely to be on the front bench for much longer. There's a good chance the Conservatives are about to spend the next couple of years in denial, ignoring their defeat and failing to oppose Labour credibly. That is the Lib Dems opening. If the last few are for any guide, the next Tory leader is likely to be weird, self-indulgent, obsessed with culture wars, and frantically trying to balance the warring factions within the Conservative Party, Reform, and the right wing in general. In particular, they're likely going to be spending their time courting back the Reform voters they lost in 2024, rather than watching their left flank. If that is the case, the Lib Dems must not let this opportunity pass them by. They must oppose Labour credibly, and do the best job of opposing the government to earn the role of official opposition. If they can do this, the prize is immense. More money, more attention, and more power. While the Lib Dems may have moved slightly to the right, the chance to jettison the Conservative Party with all of its weird hang-ups, culture wars, dodgy donor base, and toxic membership should not be passed up. Now is the time for the Lib Dems to get serious. Target Conservative seats and donors, and most of all, oppose Labour credibly. Whew. That video was a lot longer than I expected it to be, and I still had to leave out a lot of what I wanted to say. 100 internet points goes to anybody who can spot the YouTube creators I'm cribbing my style from. There's at least 3 I can see throughout this video. Thanks for watching.